Then we'll go ahead and kick this off. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining today. This is our monthly webinar series we've been doing here at Draft.dev for since the start of the year, since January, focusing on all things dev marketing, developer relations focused. Today, we're going to be diving into the intricacies of brand and content alignment for early stage startups. It happens often at Draft.dev where we have a new organization reach out to us. They just got their first seed round or Series A round of funding. They're looking to dive into content. And then usually my first question is, have you even started on some of the other lower hanging fruit yet? Like there's a lot that needs to happen before we even get to the content stage. The two people I'm joined by today are very familiar with those initial steps that I'm referencing today. We've got Rebecca, who's one of the managing partners over at Maximize, along with Brian, who's a co-founder at Reify. Their agencies are great at consulting organizations, providing that initial strategy and tactical application of creating your brand image, marketing to your audience, and sort of kicking the ball off when you get those initial rounds of funding. So let's dive into our first question here. So really what we're going to be focusing on is that early brand alignment, like I was referring to before. I always like to start high level, and then we can get a little bit more into the weeds as we dive into this. But like I was talking about earlier, people, they either want to do too much when they first start, or they want to do everything, everything they've read about in Medium or Hacker News. You got to do this now, or they're trying to focus on a step that's maybe like they're trying to run before they walk. To the two of you, what are those first initial steps an organization really needs to focus on in defining your brand identity? Because identity has to come first before everything else. Either one of you are welcome to kick off on that first initial response.
You want to take this one?
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the things that are really important to focus on in the early days, like this, one of the first things that you have to do, and it's one of the first things that we always do with new clients, is getting the co-founders and the internal stakeholders together to understand really what are the values and the mission of the company, who is the target audience, where do you fit within the competitive landscape, and how are you unique in that landscape? What are your unique value propositions? And then setting the stage for developing your positioning, your brand positioning, which will inform everything else that you do. It'll inform your product roadmap. It will inform the way that your content is developed. It will inform the way that you present yourself in sales calls. So those are some of the things that I would say are really important, in addition to things like visual identity, which definitely is malleable as things like if you're seed, you pivot and need to change.
Yeah, I think that we have a similar sort of structure, and I think it's really important to realize how important the founders are in this conversation as well. What their experience is that led them to create the company that makes this product provides a lot of context. There's usually some sort of frustration with existing tools, or insights that were gained that, were from a particular experience that might be relevant to a particular domain. A lot of it, we always say that in that early stages, we're doing a lot more listening than speaking. And it's really important to sort of document and really just organize what we're hearing. It's one of the things actually where I feel like being an external participant in that process as an agency is actually a really big leg up. We don't have the context. So you have to explain it and share what it is that caused you to form the organization and what has been interesting to you. What did you see in the market that you felt was missing? All that stuff is really important to really clarify where the points of differentiation are.
Totally. I think like the identity piece seems obvious answer, but in those early stages, I often see organizations like adjusting too quickly. Like they don't sort of write it out and see what's working and what's not, or they're just trying to, it can be a little reactionary instead of just establishing ourselves and like, here's who we are, particularly a space like ours where there tends to be a high level of competition no matter where you are in the technical space, whether it's a more established technology or if it's something that's getting a lot of funding right now. And each of the different funding ventures, they've got to have, like right now it's Gen AI. So many of these Gen AI organizations popping up. How are you differentiating yourself? What's your identity in the market? On that note, what are some of the common pitfalls you see early on? Like sort of like I was just alluding to, like people being a little reactionary, changing too quick on their identity. What are some of those early pitfalls you see organizations falling into a lot, particularly at like seed and Series A stage?
Mm-hmm. I think one of the problems that can often come up is that folks have maybe kind of an idealized vision of what their brand is or what their messaging should be. And there's a certain level of honesty that has to come with that whole process. We can't sort of just look at what I want to exist, but we have to have a product or service or actually experience that maps to that. So that's why when we start with those interviews, like Rebecca was saying, you really have to take all the source material and organize that and really think about where you are in respects to the competitive market. And there has to be, I hate to use the word authenticity, but that's really where this all comes from.
Yeah.
Right. You can't just sort of invent a brand and expect everyone to buy it. Right. It has to sort of attach itself to and be reinforced by the product and experience that you're delivering.
Anything to add there, Rebecca?
Yeah, I definitely want to build on some things that Brian said because they really resonate with me, and we find some similarities when we talk to people as well. The concept of if you build it, they will come doesn't really work here. Yeah. There are so many dev tools that are in the landscape, or if you go outside of dev tools, like I think I said this to Brian last week when we chatted, but the odds that you are like the first company that is hitting a net new market so low. So, making assumptions without talking to people is a huge mistake. Not understanding who your target audience is, like having a really clearly identified persona. These can lead to just a brand messaging platform that does not actually jive with what you're trying to build. So talking to people or not talking to people enough is something that we see as being a big problem. Talking to users or potential users, anyone who's a design partner, and getting feedback. It's sometimes hard, to Brian's point, to do that when you're so focused, you're so close to the product. And so that's one of the added benefits of bringing someone who's a third party who can look at things a little bit more objectively to parse out different ideas and put them together. Another thing that we see, which is an exercise that we really like to do, is if you ask the founding team and some of the key stakeholders, how would you describe your company in one sentence? We have never encountered somebody who is a team that is describing the company in the same way in the early days.
Yeah.
And so doing exercise like that with some kind of regularity, as the product evolves, as your brand evolves and scales, can help to see where there are inconsistencies in between the team. If product is describing something one way, sales is describing something another way, marketing is doing another way, and the CEO is going out and talking to VCs in a totally different way, you've got to bring that together to create something that's really tight.
Totally. We see this often where it's particularly when it's still the founders running the show for most elements of the organization. You forget that you're living, eating, and breathing this every single day. Like the way we write content is via technical professionals that have day jobs to do other stuff. But sometimes when a founder's working with them, they'll get frustrated. Like, why aren't you seeing the positioning here? Why aren't you understanding why this is so cool? Why aren't you geeking out about this like I am? It's like, man, they could, but like they're not living in this every day like you have with your baby, building this and creating it. I also really like the note about authenticity. I know it's sort of like a business term that gets thrown out there, but man, I'm the one marketing person here at Draft. Everyone else is technical. I've spoken to every audience under the sun, and technical professionals are the most skeptical audience out there that I've ever worked with. Like if you're not expressing that level of authenticity, if they don't feel like they're understood, they're being educated, and they feel like they're just sort of having SEO crammed down their throat, it tends to not work out very well. On that note, like, I think it'd be interesting to like fit. So you got your brand identity. Now it's like, how do we communicate ourselves to our desired audience? What are the most important elements of understanding your audience, learning who your audience is, creating those segments? Where do you start with organizations when you start diving into that element? We'll let you start, Rebecca, since I took the last one.
Sure thing. So we start with the already existing user base, if there is one. People who already have their hands on the product and are using it day to day will give the best insight in terms of what they like, what they don't like. And that's also an added benefit of talking to a third party too, is they'll be very honest with us, we find. So we spend a lot of time talking to different users of products that we're working with in order to inform also content strategy. What is valuable about the product? Where do they learn things? What benefits do they get from using the product? Where are the biggest areas of improvement? And you might not see these things from just looking at your own usage data, but actually taking the time to have these kinds of conversations with people, we find to be really valuable.
Yeah, totally. I also think that, we always ask folks who their current client base is and who they wish it was. And also, and if there's a difference, right? Sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't. Another interesting insight is to think about, the dream organization that you wish you could sell to. And if there's one person that, calls the phone or whatever at your organization, who's on the other end of the line, right? What's the person in that org that you would most feel comfortable connecting with? Ultimately, I think one of the ways that you can kind of tell if your brand and messaging are going in the right direction is that it really should feel pretty easy and kind of obvious. It's sort of the best compliment for us when we finish a messaging project and people go like, oh yeah, of course, right? Because if it really feels like this whole net new thing and you're inventing something from whole cloth and it doesn't feel natural, or it's very different from where you thought you were going to end up, then it's probably manufactured in some way. And that can be sometimes because it's been maybe too influenced by a cohort of people that you're thinking you're wanting to sell to. If you're used to operating in a community space and communicating with developers as an example, and you're going to go out and try to sell a huge enterprise product that sells for 6 figures and up, it's a very, very different kind of communication style, very different kind of messaging, very different kind of brand potentially. I'm not saying those things are impossible, but it should feel like you're starting from a place of comfort and that these are communities you're used to speaking to regularly. That's when it's sort of the most effective, I think.
Totally. Couldn't agree more. So we're figuring out our identity, got a general idea of the audience that we at least want to go out after, who we're resonating with. Now it's time to start giving them some information to digest, right? Everyone always, like, we see often people are like, oh, we've got to get the video go, we've got to get the webinars go, we've got to get the Discord going, but then their documentation may be lacking, or they don't have a quick start developed yet for people to quickly learn about their solution. What are those first pieces of information and content that you suggest that you start sending out after you make those initial strategy decisions?
I think that one of the most effective ways to start is to sort of work backwards from the onboarding flow of a product or a journey.
Interesting.
And a thing that's interesting about that, especially if you're looking at, breaking down a user journey to adopt something, right? There's usually a couple steps that are critical that people cross over. And a principle that we had at GitHub that I think is very effective in this case, the phrase is like, every communication should have a URL. Everything that you're trying to communicate to someone else should have a durable, permanent URL that actually communicates whatever that is. So if you're starting out with working through what the user journey is for adoption, if you're trying to explain something to someone, let's not put 800 words in an email. Let's actually link to things that are useful, right? What are those things? And you're going to find 100 things that you wish you had a URL for. And that, I think, is the greatest way to have a map of the first batch of content, is that it actually directly supports something to your audience at a time of need as they're going through the adoption cycle. So everything else is sort of a maturing step after that. But that first step is often overlooked because we just sort of assume, to your point earlier, that everyone's living and breathing the same stuff that we are and they can just jump right in. So, it's also why customer support is so incredibly helpful to marketing in this context. Where are people getting stuck? Where are we hearing questions in the sales process? If you have an answer to those things, there needs to be a URL for that, right? And where that goes is a secondary conversation, but I think it's a good framework to build your content strategy around.
Talk about getting third-party eyes on your stuff, like let them dive into your documentation. And we've seen people that take it as a learning lesson. They're like, well, if a senior engineer struggle with our stuff, maybe we need to improve it a lot. And then there's the others that are like, no, why don't you understand our documentation? It's like, definitely different approaches there. Anything to add there, Rebecca?
I agree with Brian, everything Brian said. Understanding the customer journey, how they ultimately adopt your product is really crucial in setting up the foundation of the content that you build out for your documentation. Onboarding is also just really key. People are really strapped for time. If you have an audience, especially that is that they're in roles that they are very crunched for time, which a lot of developers are, then making sure that onboarding is as simple as it possibly can be, or as clearly explained as it possibly can be, is really important.
So, got our audience, strategy, brand identity. At what stage do you start letting start diving into competitive analysis, start looking at who the market is? Is that do a little bit of that early on, do it all up front, maybe wait a little bit for it? There's always you want to avoid just monkey see, monkey do, but if something's effective that the rest of the competition is doing, maybe you want to be looking into that. Where's that balance for you guys when it comes to competitive analysis, when that starts being involved in the process, and when you really like to focus on it?
For us, that's a big part of the initial brand positioning setup. How do you fit into the ecosystem that you're trying to enter or that you are already a part of? Where do you sit versus your competitors, and how do you differentiate yourself? So before we even get to what does your content look like, it's how do you fit in with competitors or stand out from competitors, I guess I should say, to develop this brand strategy. With that said, after that is out, it's always a good idea to keep up with competitors, new entrants to the market, and what they're doing. But we think our philosophy at Maximize anyway is that you shouldn't be spending too much time focusing on, well, what is this competitor doing? What is competitor Y doing? What's competitor Z doing? Because ultimately, if you're following, like you said, Clayton, monkey see, monkey do, you'll never innovate fast enough. So this is where, really listening and focusing on your user base, your community, becomes sometimes more important. Not sometimes, it is more important. What are the people who are using your product actually saying and doing is more important than what a Fortune 100 company is doing, because they'll never innovate as fast as you. If you're a seed stage company, you are going to be rocking and rolling with your small team that is able to just innovate as you get user feedback and people push your product in one direction or the other, or you let data that you're getting from users push your product in one direction or the other, that should be your biggest focus. And that's our philosophy behind just watching competitors.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that in a way, people can get a little too obsessed with, the competition and sort of overly focused. However, at the same time, from a sales motion, I've also seen sort of the opposite, where folks are like, no one competes with us. We're in our own space, right? And that's usually a sign of sort of immature sales motions, because they're not actually routinely in head-to-head competitions, but that absolutely will come. And so completely avoiding having some way of effectively communicating your points of differentiation in a competitive market is absolutely crucial and non-optional, because it will happen without you if you don't do it. So it's really important to know enough to have something sensible to say in those kind of head-to-head situations, but also, not be so obsessed with it that it's all you do is follow someone else around.
I could not agree with that more. We see that a lot from founders, especially, who say, when we ask them the question of who are your primary competitors, who are your direct competitors, and so many people say we don't have any. Indirect competitors, it's easy to parse out a couple most of the time, but it's just a sign also that you have to have more conversations with people who are either your users or your target users, because most likely they chose your tool for another tool, or they had a decision to make, and what were they evaluating at the same time as you? It's very infrequently. I don't know if really, we'll keep it very infrequently. Have I ever seen a founding team that has said, we don't have any direct competitors, and then when we did some extra digging, found that they actually didn't have direct competitors?
I also see the opposite too, where they will label someone as a direct competitor, and it's this tool that does a wide spectrum of tasks, and there's this minor piece of functionality that aligns with a minor piece of functionality with their own tool, and they're labeling that as a direct competitor. I'm like, I don't know if that's what you should be primarily focused on here. It's always interesting seeing how, like you said, particularly founders can approach that. It all just goes back to living in it every day. It just gives you a different perspective on things. Sort of going down that same path, I always say people by people. So when you're talking about competitors, direct competitors, how you're positioning yourself, how can you sort of leverage that startup story within the storytelling of how you're aligning your content, how you're positioning yourself to the, like I said, that highly skeptical audience we're typically speaking to? And this story honestly probably differs too. Another caveat I'll add here on if you're open source and looking at focusing more on that end user versus a tool that may be more enterprise focused. Love to hear your opinions on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the most important aspect of connecting to a community via sort of storytelling and narratives is deeply appreciating their perspective and having empathy for where they're coming from. A lot of times we're trying to sell the new thing and really push some sort of change. But that can kind of fall on deaf ears if we're not actually acknowledging what the reality of current on the ground facts are. How do people normally operate? What are the actual pain points, not just sort of manufactured? There's a way to, I think, connect with people that shows that you're not just speaking to a community, but that you're a part of it. And I think that the universality of good storytelling is critical to these kinds of communications, because it really demonstrates that this is coming from a place that sounds trustworthy and actually seems like there's a perspective here that I can believe in. So I think those are sort of the things that are most important in that respect.
The things that we think about are the things that we talk about with founders a lot specifically is about how they can leverage their own stories. And Brian, you mentioned this when we were just chatting earlier about the brand identification and setting that initial messaging platform framework. Authenticity is so important in this storytelling and in the early days of fostering community and really getting people to believe that you are the subject matter expert that you are claiming to be. And because so many of the founders who are building developer tools specifically are building them from problems that they have already faced, there is just a connection that can be made that feels like it's hard, but can actually be quite simple. And that's why we really stress to founders that in the early days, when things like PR and, like very more sophisticated kinds of outreach and also more expensive kinds of outreach seem like they might not be a great fit at this point, leveraging the founder stories and their experiences is so important. And we see this a lot with brands who have come. I mean, I think one of the brands that I see do this really well is a company called Incident, who's disrupting like the on-call market, and their founding team is just constantly sharing their own stories about culture, about what led them to build Incident, and it's great for fostering community.
Mm-hmm. I have this conversation probably like 8 times a week where people come to us to execute content, and the first thing that they're like, they haven't even started their blog yet, and they're wanting to get into the nitty gritty of content. I'm like, you need to have your Colonel Sanders, the CEO, the founder, cranking out thought leadership right now, not asking us to write articles about it. Like that's such valuable material that you guys are referencing right now. Why we exist, how we were created, our place in the market, opinions on where the industry is going. Don't have someone else write that. I tell this all the time, like have your internal people write that stuff because they're going to be able to express it in more authentic manner than anyone else. And like do that stuff first, like get that out of the gates. So we've got our identity, strategies more established, we're maturing in our marketing strategy. Where are the different areas of content that you recommend people branching out to from there? Like sort of identifying the paths you can take and the different categories where you can start expanding your content strategy.
So like some of the initial channels or what?
Yeah, channels or types of fair play. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's all about what adds value. For this kind of audience, we're just thinking about what can we produce that will actually help people. And Dave Gerhardt, who's like incredible B2B marketer, has a saying, and I will butcher it a little bit, but the whole thesis behind it is, if you build out content and build out just things in general that are genuinely helpful to people, and they are going to you, not just to use your product, but to ask and seek expert opinions from you or to learn something new, you will just like be reaping the benefits of it. You will have not only people who are super loyal to you, but you'll also just get new eyes, new customers. And we think about this personally, like we're thinking about this in the ways that SEO is changing. You will definitely see a lot of companies that are creating content that is just absolute gibberish. They're using AI and they're not even looking at and checking what's happening, and they will produce content that will get them at the top of search results quickly. But when it comes to actual acquisition, you're going to have massive bounce rates from that kind of content. So what can you produce that will actually be valuable, whether it is like the blog content or it's technical tutorials, if it's creating communities on places like Discord where people can just share their their thoughts and new things that they're finding and talk about your tooling or other things, and just creating a community for them. Having events where people who are like-minded can come together, social channels where you're promoting things like user-generated content, and also just like actively engaging with people, using it as another kind of community tooling. I think it's really important. You have to ask yourself first, where can we provide the most valued people possible? And
I always
maybe
ask these questions like that on purpose because the answer always is it depends. I know people hate that response, but it's the truth of the matter. I totally agree.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, there's a lot of interesting nuanced questions that we can get into about content delivery and channels and strategy and performance, right? But there's also an aspect that this is something that for a lot of organizations is just really hard to do anything in and keep any kind of momentum up. And I think that, good marketing really benefits from sort of compound interests. You continue to invest in it, you create assets that are useful. You have to keep it going, because if you take the foot off the gas and there's just nothing happening for a while, then the market opinion, to be honest, becomes, is this company alive? Not, is this the best company to choose for this particular product or service, right? There become sort of viability questions. And so really it's important to get in, instead of maybe even initially focusing on exactly the channels or the tactics or even the topics, is creating the organizational habits of the basic, most fundamental aspect of marketing is do things and tell people, right? If you're doing things, then you probably have stuff to talk about. And it doesn't even have to be things that you've shipped that are publicly available yet. I think another sort of easily mineable resource when it comes to content production is just the media diet of the people who work there. You're consuming content too. And there are things that you're sharing within your teams about, you're reacting, you have opinions, you have thoughts on things that are happening in the industry. If it's worth sharing with the 5 or 6 people in a Slack channel, it's probably worth a small blog post sharing why that's interesting to form the opinions that relate to the product that you're selling. There's immense opportunity to have an opportunity to communicate with your audience about the things that are important to you. And unfortunately, a lot of it just ends with the logistics of getting the content out the door. So I think in some respects, it's just making sure that that's as well oiled as possible and making it something that lots of people in the organization can contribute to, that you are producing a lot and that the channels will, emerge that are most productive. But as we all know, you're not going to create the world's greatest blog post and get 7 million people signing up for it, right? It takes multiple brand impressions. It takes multiple touches. I'm not even reading everything you're posting, but the fact that you posted it is interesting, and it's accruing brand equity and interest in the organization. So in some respects, it's really the habits of the organization that support emitting this kind of content that's like the most important thing. And you can kind of fine tune as an advanced maneuver later. But without this, you can nail all the best channels and all the best content, but if you do it infrequently, it's not going to yield.
It's the death of content. I preach this all the time, like it's my religion, but often compare SEO to get tactical to like people's diets. And I was like, oh, I shouldn't eat legumes, or I need to eat more berries for antioxidants. So the SEO, they're worried about playing the algorithm game. I'm like, is your calorie count even in check? Are you even consistently publishing new content that's relevant to your reader over an extended period of time? Because unfortunately, most people are not. Everyone gets hung up and they want to put out 8+ articles or websites or pages. And then you end up in this production pattern where you're publishing once a month, and then you'll do 2 months later, and then you'll do a blog post in 3 months. And that disjointed effort is just the death of, the audience, the death of SEO typically is what we've found. So how often, when you're developing your strategies and you've got something laid out for a while, how often do you want to revise that strategy? There's sort of this balance of typically with general marketing strategy and then specifically content, it takes a while to see results. How long do you want to reflect on that, measure your KPIs, and then actually adjust it as you continue to move down the path? Let's go, Rebecca, this time. Put you in the corner.
Oh, yes. So, yeah, I think especially when you're an early stage company, having your eyes on the on the button of like how are things performing, are certain pieces of content working or not working is really important. This is a totally different kind of conversation that we could get into, but what we find is a lot of startups don't actually know what happens after people read a blog post. Their marketing attribution is not set up properly, and things like that are really important to understand down the line. How, if yes, maybe you're getting 70 billion views on a blog post, but then what happens? And also you're getting traffic, but you don't understand how those people are converting or if they're converting. And that makes it really difficult when you're ready to invest more into content, build out your team further, or to, hire an outside agency to double down on it. It makes it difficult to really justify doing that. So when it comes to the revision of your strategies, first, having that marketing attribution in place is really important. Data-backed decisions, super important. We go through like pretty regular audits, like quarterly audits and every 6 months audits, looking at what's performing, what's not. You will find that there are patterns of things that are working and things that don't. And you have to just be really decisive. Like, this is not working at this time. Let's cut it. Let's invest in this, introduce a new kind of content pillar. Because it's just, if you don't have the data to kind of make those decisions, though, beyond traffic numbers, you could be cutting something that maybe doesn't get as many views, but has been converting everybody who hits it. So it's really important to have those kind of things.
Or just defending your budget, like particularly at smaller startups, you're sort of like, money is usually tight in its allocation. You want to make sure that you can justify why you need to continue those efforts.
That's tough. It's also tough because there are a lot of organizations that think that they're investing in content without actually putting the money there. So they say, to the point we just made about the regular content production of not just having a blog post go out once a month or once every 3 months. People think that by putting out 1 to 3 pieces of content every month, that they are investing in content. It's not. It's definitely not. And also, you won't see returns on that. Even in space for content development. And then, Brian, I think you just made this point too. You're not going to see immediate returns. It takes time for these things to grow. And also, Carl actually does a good job of this, of sharing the analytics. I saw him he's put out a LinkedIn post of
I just shared, I think, that exact article in the chat. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. On the same page then.
On the same page,
That's
yeah.
Yeah, I think, if you're changing your strategy too frequently, it's obviously a sign of that is that you're not doing it with any sense of confidence, because there isn't data behind it. You just sort of have a feeling like it's not doing what you want it to do. And then on the other end, if it's too infrequently, you're not really reading the room, right? There's usually conversations that happen within communities or within the space that you're operating in, the kind of product you're selling. And if you're not paying attention to where those conversations are going, you're not really being a participant in it. And you can kind of be seen as a laggard, even just from a content perspective. So yeah, I think, roughly it is something you probably want to look at. Maybe, quarterly seems probably perfect in terms of doing a true up and actually running the data and looking at it and making it part of your practice. But also I think it's nice to, especially if you do have folks that are more in the external comms sort of practice, if there are folks in the PR bent that you're working with, a lot of times they can provide really great context because they're seeing things external to you that you're probably ignoring. And so those kinds of things can help sharpen the view on what it is that you want to be communicating about as well.
Totally. We've got quite a few questions in the Q&A, so we're going to start a couple minutes early on diving into a few of these. The first one here, early stage brand and content management sounds overwhelming. What are some of your favorite content management systems and organization tools you can't live without?
To not disparage any tools or systems, I would say that the most important thing is that it's a tool that everyone has appropriate access to and can get things out the door.
Totally.
I would be much, much, much more in favor of any twigs and glue solution over any giant product if it means that people are going to get stuff out the door. I think that it can certainly be overwhelming, and there are a lot of tools in the space, some with better metrics than others. And there's a whole other question that comes up typically when it comes to technology. SaaS companies is sort of, where does the blog live? Oftentimes it gets built in a day quickly before the launch post goes out, that it's part of the product, right? And there's an aspect of that that's helpful and some that's less helpful. And whether the website is something that's managed by marketing exclusively or not, there's lots of details that are almost unique, I feel like, to this sector, because we're talking about companies that are tool builders. So there's a lot of DIY happening. But ultimately, I think really it boils down to access and frequency. I think getting a system that allows people to contribute is the most important thing before even a specific tool choice is in our mix.
It's a very good diplomatic answer to not disparage anybody. But it's correct. Like, whatever is going to be something that the team can actually push out content on is going to be the best. There are definitely expensive options out there, like HubSpot, and there are options out there that you really need to make sure that you're, unless you are a technical marketer and are able to push out content yourself, that you'll have to make sure that the team is working with you, to like a dev team is working with you, like a Contentful, which is also like very powerful. So it depends. And then when it comes to organizational, I think it's also the same kind of answer of, what can people on your team access? It's like, this is such a personal question to an organization of like, what can the team access, and what is easiest for everybody to be able to, or the people who are the stakeholders here and the decision makers, what can they easily integrate with? So, I mean, if you're already on like if you're already like on the Atlassian train and want to use Asana, or if your team is really into Trello or Monday, I mean, it's just whatever works best for you. But I think any good options personally, and I will disparage them, I'm not a Notion fan. I think that it's like not the best for collaboration. But you can just go with what makes sense for your team. That was a really good answer, Brian.
Yeah, he's more diplomatic. I was gonna say I've seen enough home cooked content management systems now to recommend, like, just go use someone that actually does it. I know you can build it on your own. Doesn't mean you need to. Like, there's some cheap options out there. All right, so this was interesting. I have quite a bit of opinions on this. I'm sure you guys do too. What percentage of AI content is produced for your dev tool customers compared to human written content? What positive or negative impact has that AI content had for your customers' growth? We just generally recommend human when possible. The issue we find with AI, particularly in our space, is like it's leaning on what's already on the internet, right? So I suggest using it more as like a planning tool to help speed up the process of writing your content, potentially, of like getting general structures, topic areas, points in line, but you have got to go in there and edit it yourself, or you're going to be losing that authenticity with that skeptical audience we speak to. Like, if you're an engineer, DevOps professional, data scientist, security professional, you're going to be able to tell if this was written by AI reflecting on previously written technical content, or if this was written by a professional that understands the space. However, what I do think might be interesting is like some people are using Gen AI to train like specific AI models for like searching their internal documentation and being very knowledgeable in that. There's potentially some stuff on the forefront in that area. How do you guys feel about it?
I am a proponent of using AI when it comes to building out things like your skeleton draft. You need to have people who are refining the work that you're doing. But especially when it comes to building out a content engine, when people have a lot of different responsibilities because you're a small tactile team, being able to use AI to help you to build out what does the first iteration of this look like, even in like a very basic drafting way, is really helpful to just give you that head start. But like, you're so right. It is so obvious when AI is behind some of these things and no one has taken the time to look at it. Like if I go to another blog post and it's in this transformational era of yada yada yada, where like it's just language is the same. You have to be making a good amount of changes. And the other thing is too, I think that the kind of content here it totally changes. You're doing something like your C-level thought leadership. One, personally, I think if it's like a painful thing for your CTO to be putting out posts and you can do like a 2 to 3 hour interview with them and get like use the transcripts to find, the biggest, like some of the themes that they discussed. I think that makes it easier for them. Great way to use it. Some of the culture pieces, or when you get to like employer brand, it's a great tool to use. When you're getting into more of like the documentation and more like technical pieces of content, you really, really just need humans at this point.
Yeah, I mean, an interesting question is like, would you read a book by AI? Right, like
I'm gonna have to steal that. That's
I think you literally do. I don't think you would, but I agree. And I have used a little bit in terms of like compressing data, and I should just shout out, I love that idea. I think interviewing people is a amazing hack for content production, as evidenced even by this conversation we're having now, is that everyone can talk for hours, but people can't seem to type for hours. So if you can get someone on the phone, talk to them for an hour, record it, getting a distillation of that or a bullet list of topics or things that flow from those conversations, it can be super helpful. Michael Bernstein, my partner at Reify, will often says that if you have a really good outline, the rest is just typing, and it kind of feels that way, right? If somebody is sort of an expert on the space and you have a solid outline that has reasonable progression and flow, most any one of us as a professional can sort of fill in the blanks and make it useful and real from a human perspective. So it's not that the tool has no power here, but I think that for the kind of content we're trying to emit, computers are good at making content for other computers, i.e. SEO, but if you're trying to talk to a person, you should probably write it yourself.
I think tool is the key word here. It shouldn't be doing your content, but it's a great tool in the tool belt. It's sort of like using your Texas Instruments calculator for, your algebra homework or something like that. Like, very effective tool. It's not going to do it all for you. It still needs the human input. Particularly, I mean, you guys probably work with organizations too, where they're so far on the cutting edge that like AI is not even going to be able to do something for the type of content they're writing. It's just going to get blatantly wrong often. Okay, next one here. Any content strategy tips when the product pivots in a significant way? We see this a lot with seed startups where they're like changing functionality on the fly, positioning, audience, stuff like that. I'm sure you guys see this pretty frequently too.
Yeah, I think there's kind of two questions there. I mean, one of which is it a sort of elephant in the room kind of pivot, right? So sometimes there are changes where it's an evolution of the product. You're focusing on a particular area more than others, in which I think the natural pattern of what you would do is sort of the right strategy. There are cases we've worked with some companies where there was maybe an emerging category that they realized later on that they were participating in, right? So if you're really early stage and you're really kind of broad and thin, but you find your space and kind of go deep in that area, that's sort of maturing of the product as well. And there's an interesting kind of third question, which is like, do you consider all the content that you produced permanent or not? Is this stuff still relevant that I wrote a year ago for a different product? So I think that, in a way, if you are going through a pivot, there's usually some reason for that, whether it's market or products or experience or change in technology. And I think that all of those things, in addition to whatever the new product is, whatever the motivations were, those are very interesting stories. And it's not something that you need to be ashamed of or hide. I think it's actually really compelling and interesting because you learned something. And so sharing that, I think, is really good content on its own.
I like that take a lot. Totally. Anything else, Rebecca? Yeah.
I think that's great. I really like the last point, especially.
Totally.
You are pivoting for a reason. You're pivoting and you've changed your product direction or like the entire scope of what this company does because you saw something that wasn't working with the old version and you wanted to make changes to address the market better. Share your insights. I mean, like it feels like I guess it's something people don't want to talk about. I don't know if I've seen like a ton of content of this is why we pivoted and this is why. But like, that's interesting. It's something that almost every founder will go through. What's the chance you raised seed funding, that the product that you went and pitched to investors when you were raising seed is the same product that are in the same product direction that you will go into your A with? Low, super low. Some things are changing. You're getting more users, you're getting more feedback, you have more revenue, and it gives you insight to be able to say, this is what we're doing right, and this needs to change. Share that. Building in public is incredible. Again, something Carl does really well. Build in public. It also really helps with the authenticity, building trust, if people have an idea of where you're going and where you've come so far. I love that.
Totally. And it doesn't invalidate all that other work you did before either. It shows that natural growth progression. Yeah, it's totally. All right, well, we'll end on more of a tactical question here. So this last one, how does an early stage brand know what brings value? This is sort of a tricky one, I guess, when it comes to like KPIs, the measurables, because like you said, some of it takes a while for it to realize its value. Others, like you can see quickly. I'd be curious to hear your answers here. Here at Draft, we're very honed in on like the content area, but there's a lot more out there to measure as far as marketing success goes.
Mm-hmm.
And then this one is not like, it sort of depends answer for me too. Like, what are your goals and what are you striving for? I don't know.
So I think they're like in general, when it comes to marketing, there are some things that are not measurable. There are some things, you just have to go based on the feeling of what it does for people. Like it brings them closer to your product. It brings them, it drives more trust. It spreads your brand in kind of this immeasurable way. We'll give the example of, so my partner for Maximize, he is one of the co-founders of DigitalOcean. And in the early days, he spent like $25,000 to create a mascot for DigitalOcean, which is Sammy the Shark, from the same person, I think, who also created Octocat, that worked with the same designer. But an Octocat is also a great example, but like between Sammy the Shark and Octocat, you have like these mascots who have been on how many millions of shirts, how many millions of people's computers. And you can't measure that. I mean, I guess you could measure how many shirts you've produced, right? But how many people have seen that as a result of you sending someone a sticker? And this is not about content at all, so I'm sorry, but just to say there are measurable and unmeasurable things, and then you have the things that are measurable. And why I kind of just go in this more, like marketing attribution from the start is super, super important. It's very hard to do. There are tools that are better and some that are not better, and I won't disparage anyone right now to do that. But you have to think about, yes, what the KPIs are, also what the values of the company are. How community oriented you are to grow, and reevaluate with some regularity, not maybe every week, but quarterly, every 6 months, yearly, and get the right people in the room, which is also a hard thing to do, to be able to pivot and make changes in your content strategy and your marketing strategy overall, and then actually execute on it, which is a whole other difficult thing.
Yeah, I think another aspect is sort of understanding this stuff is when, I'm a big fan of events. I think it's really important to directly interact with the community and participate in a person-to-person kind of way. And the same is true for sales calls, whether they're in person or not. I think there's a reflection sometimes that you can get that is sort of hard to capture in numbers, as Rebecca was saying. It's like, what do you know about us? Why are you even in the room with me in the first place, right? Why are you attending this talk? How much do you know about what we do, what we stand for, what we're interested in? How many people are coming by the booth because they just want to say, hey, I really appreciate the stuff that you're doing, right? Or attending the talk because they want to hear this new perspective. There's a lot of things that are harder to measure in that way. But you can certainly see it over a longer period of time, right? More and more people that you're coming into the sales funnel are much more educated about the product. They're much more sure that your brand is at the top of the list rather than the unknown question mark at the bottom.
Great stuff all around. Brian, Rebecca, thank you so much for joining today. I hope everyone found this useful. We'll be sending out a recording and a follow-up blog post as we do here at Draft over the coming days. Otherwise, thank you, everyone. And join us in June for the next one. See you later.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks so much.